today's conversation is sort of a special one because it's not so much a program as it is a meta program, a conversation about the conversations we have on North Korea, which is something that we do a lot, not only here at KEI, but in Washington more generally. I joined KEI in September 2015. I often like to joke that North Korea gave me about 3 months to get the hang of things around here before the speed really started to pick up in January of 2016 when they tested the fourth nuclear device. Sort of since then, it's been a lot of North Korea all the time. In that time, there's been a big interest in, especially in the past, not so much 3 years, but especially in the past 2 years, big interest in Korea, especially in the U.S., and an increase in number of North Korea watchers, people who follow events in North Korea pretty closely, and how it's been interesting to see how that conversation impacts how the two governments, Seoul and Washington, see each other and see the issues and the challenges that are unfolding in North Korea. So with us today to talk about these issues is Professor Jeffrey Robertson. Professor Robertson is an assistant professor at Yonsei University and also a visiting fellow at the Asia Pacific College of Diplomacy. He'll give his presentation based off the paper that he's written for us as part of our academic paper series. He actually contributed, 2 years ago? 2 years ago on South Korea foreign policy continuity. And it's actually, as we get ready for your presentation, just like to note, it's a pretty good timeline in which we're talking about this issue because it's been almost 1 year since the first Moon Kim meeting in the DMZ. So I'll turn things over now to Jeff, and then we'll come back up on stage for a bit of a Q&A.
So first of all, I've of course got to say thank you to the Korea Economic Institute for inviting me here, and thank you to Kyle for arranging it all. So I'm going to be talking on North Korea. 2 years ago, I was here talking on South Korea. The number of people in the audience was about half as much. This basically justifies my project on North Korea watchers. Put North Korea in the title, you have twice as many audience members. There's something to say about watching North Korea and why there's so many North Korea watchers. You can see there my contact details on the screen. This will go up again at the end, and I encourage you to contact me if you have any interest in the broader project of North Korea watchers, which I'll talk about very shortly. So I'm going to go through 6 points today. First of all, I'll give an introduction to the broader project of North Korea watchers. I'll talk about the focus of the current paper, which is Language in Foreign Policy Analysis. Then I'll look at the theory behind today's paper, which is conceptualizing international relations as interlingual relations. I'll touch upon the methodology, the results, and the limits, but I'll leave most of that detail to you if you want to read the paper. And then I'll spend a little bit more time on the policy implications and the recommendations. So, as I said, this is one small component of a much broader research project looking at North Korea watchers. So North Korea watchers are the community of scholars, analysts, government officers, NGO advocates, and journalists who, for one reason or another, spend a portion of their lives watching North Korea. North Korea watchers have always intrigued me. They're an incredibly disparate group. But when they come together at conferences or seminars or impromptu events to discuss emerging crises, you can see characteristics which they all share. They've got a real cultural identity, a sense of common understanding, a recognition of familiar language, symbols and oral narrative, and in broad terms, even a shared sense of mission. So, as a former government officer and as a parliamentary researcher, I interacted with a lot of North Korea watchers. And when I was working for the government, I mixed with one particular North Korea watcher who greatly intrigued me. And this just shows how disparate and sometimes eccentric or odd North Korea watchers can be. This one individual is incredibly intelligent, a really, really good analyst. He's watched North Korea all his life. And, he's in his, well, let's say late 50s, early 60s maybe. And all his life he's been watching North Korea and even surviving financially by watching North Korea. Yet he mixes his North Korea watching with a passion for cabaret, for poetry and literature. I mean, this is almost an eccentric odd fellow watching North Korea and being one of the best at watching North Korea. This intrigues me. Why do people watch North Korea? What's the interest in continuously monitoring North Korea? So anyone who has watched North Korea knows that every time the peninsula goes into crisis, more North Korea's watchers emerge. And arguably, the Trump administration brought one of the most recent flare-ups and the most recent increase in the number of North Korea watchers. But for the first time ever, there was also a platform where all of these North Korea watchers could interact, social media. So we've got a flare-up in the number of North Korea watchers, and we've got a place where they're all interacting and, well, competing. A lot of rivalry emerged. And if you watch carefully, you start to see very distinct geographic, professional, political, linguistic, and cultural differences between these North Korea watchers. So for me, I thought it was time to actually launch a project looking at the North Korea watchers. You can see here a social media post which I put up to attract people to fill in a survey which I put out to North Korea watchers. So I launched this project with, quite a comprehensive research approach, both quantitative and qualitative. I accessed source lists of contributors to North Korea commentary from a variety of locations, including universities, government agencies, and institutions. I looked and reached out to every known North Korea watcher source. I scanned articles from the media. I got names from academic databases, names from seminar and conference agenda lists. And I reached out to other North Korea watchers and asked them to spread it out, snowball sampling, to reach out to every corner of the North Korea watching community. In the end, I got 468 responses to a survey. I subsequently did a more detailed survey of 58 of those individuals, and those 58 were selected based upon their representativeness of ideal types of North Korea watchers, very distinct types of North Korea watchers. So I'm currently undertaking the qualitative stage of this North Korea watcher study. And the qualitative stage is an ethnographic study. So I spend time with North Korea watchers in their own environment, interacting with them, observing them, just like, 19th century ethnographers would do with some foreign tribe. I'm watching the North Korea watchers in much the same way. So the end result is going to be a very detailed picture, a very detailed, informative, and I think quite entertaining study about North Korea watchers. So my initial aim in launching this project on North Korea watchers was actually to answer the question, should we know more about the expert community that informs decision makers on a conflict-prone issue? An important question. But, after my initial research, I found out that, whether expert communities actually influence decision-making at all, it's totally up in the air. So 2003 Iraq conflict, a lot of studies have been done on that and the expert community and their advice given and provided to the public before the conflict. There was a lot of information which went out, including a number of petitions by leading scholars opposing any conflict. This all had very little influence on decision-making in the decision to go into conflict. So, whether an expert community such as the North Korea watcher community really has any influence upon decision-making, it's a whole nother question. And I'll go into that in a little bit more detail why towards the end of the presentation. But for me, the interest lies in the ethnographic study. Who are the North Korea watchers and what are they doing? So the current study is focused on just one small aspect of this. So my North Korea Watcher study focuses on the English language community. So I needed to distinguish the English language North Korea watching community from the Korean language North Korea watching community. Needed to distinguish and contrast between them. So this study looks specifically at language and culture and its role in foreign policy analysis. So if we extend foreign policy analysis to include intelligence analysis and strategic analysis, there's quite a few studies done on the different requirements between having cultural and linguistic knowledge versus subject knowledge. So this debate is ongoing and it's pretty much unsettled still. But pretty much you need a balance between the two. So if you think about it in the context of the Korean Peninsula, you can have an individual who is an absolute expert in non-proliferation. They can know the political paths that a state takes to get a nuclear capability. They can be an expert in the technological and human resources which are required to secure and maintain nuclear capability. They could be totally aware through experience as well as through learning of previous US policy efforts to address similar non-proliferation issues. But whether any of this can actually apply to the very unique and distinct situation of North Korea is another question. Similarly, you can have a North Korea watcher or a Korea specialist who is absolutely fluent in the language, an absolute expert in North Korean literature, North Korean rhetoric, all affairs North Korean. They know about the leadership, they know about the structures, they know everything about North Korea. But if they know nothing about US diplomatic processes and US political processes, can they comment on the situation? Not really. So you really need a balance between the two. And a lot of intelligence literature points out that you really need a balance between subject knowledge on the one hand and area knowledge or linguistic cultural knowledge on the other hand. So this leads to the question, how does language and culture impact policy discourse on North Korea? Or to put it another way, is Pyongyang different in Washington and Seoul? So I'll just go back to the last slide for a second regarding cultural knowledge. So cultural knowledge in international relations is very important. So there's been a cultural turn in international relations during the 1990s, and it's recognized that culture should play a larger role in understanding international relations. So there's one particular study which I think has been a big influence on my research at this stage, and that is a study by an Australian National University academic named Anthony Milner. So he was looking at the South China Sea issue, and he brought out an argument which points out that calculations regarding international behavior are shapen by taken for granted notions about the nature of states and sovereignty and the operation of power. So he really brings out the argument that culture deserves more attention as an explanatory factor in East Asia's international relations. So in my paper, I also argue that culture needs to play a larger role as an explanatory factor in the way we look at North Korea. And of course, culture also plays a very large role in understanding policy discourse. So policy discourse is always rhetoric, and in all forms of rhetoric, understanding how people seek to persuade other people, you need to fully understand language and culture. So, is Pyongyang different in Washington and Seoul? So, Washington and Seoul, I just use as representations of decision-making centers. So before anyone starts wondering, I recognize that decision-making also occurs in other centers, particularly places like Florida and perhaps Busan. And I also take into account the fact that English language speakers and Korean language speakers exist in both centers. So there is transfer of knowledge between the two languages, but as I'll touch upon a little bit later, social linguistic theories point out that in language hierarchies, there's very distinct flows between the two languages. And this can lead to specific ways of understanding concepts in each language. So the theory behind the current paper is that, international relations should be understood as interlingual relations. So in a very important study on international relations and understanding it as interlingual relations, an academic named Einar Weigen of the University of Oslo points out that despite the expansion of international society and the narrowing of political vocabularies, residues of political cultural differences remain. So if you think about international relations at the moment, it's still predominantly a Western field. Certainly there are efforts to decrease this very Western approach to international relations, but it's still very much dominated by Western scholarship. International relations itself is not an old discipline, but in South Korea, it's particularly young. So think of it, it's only since the 1980s that large numbers of South Koreans have started traveling abroad. It's only since the 1990s that large numbers of South Koreans started studying abroad. And it's even only since the 2000s that universities in South Korea established graduate schools of international studies. So international relations was not a mainstream field in South Korea until, well, relatively speaking, quite recently. So it's a fact that international relations concepts have to travel into the Korean language. And all interpretation and translation is dependent upon context and historical experience. So translations can have different connotations that rest on historical experiences, with divergent meanings that will inevitably lead to divergences in the legitimacy of political practices. Conceptual translation is particularly difficult. So concepts travel across linguistic boundaries as individual interpretations at individual points of time. So this means that you can have one concept which travels over a linguistic boundary at one point of time, then another interpretation will come at another point of time, and another will come at another point of time. And each one of these interpretations will evolve. So it's best to, explain this through an example of the significant impact that this can actually have. So I'm not sure if you're aware of the concept of the middle power. So middle power is a fairly prominent term in international relations. And at different periods has actually achieved a degree of common understanding. So the modern usage of the term began in the post-war period and towards the end of the Second World War. So at that period of time, it was predominantly a term used by diplomats and then spread and proliferated throughout the media. So it's not a precise definition. And it's specifically related to a set number of states who are seeking to play a larger role in post-World War II governance. There were states which believed that they could and should do more, and they sought recognition of this. So states such as Canada, Australia, the Netherlands, Norway, Sweden, and back in the post-World War II period, also Mexico and South Africa. So as the concept started to evolve and started to pass over to the political scientists, there were attempts to make it a more precise definition. So they started to think of it in the context of a way they could measure it. So this is related to measuring the capacity of states. So the idea is that you have an international hierarchy of states. At the top there, you have your superpowers, then you have your great powers perhaps, and then you have this distinct little sweet spot where the middle powers sit. And you can find them there by measuring GDP or measuring their military material capacity, so on. So the definition gets more precise. The definition again was refined at the end of the Cold War. This time a new generation of scholars started to look at middle powers, and they started to say, well, middle powers are states which act in certain characteristic behaviors. So middle powers were thought to pursue activist diplomacy, coalition building, niche diplomacy, and good international citizenship. So around about the 2000s, we could imagine, South Korea is definitely a middle power. Look at it. We know that it's got a distinct capacity in that sweet spot in the measurement of the hierarchy of international states. And we could say, it's starting to demonstrate characteristic diplomatic behavior. We can imagine South Korea as a middle power. Around 2003, 2004, the middle power concept became a pillar in the Roh Moo-hyun government's foreign policy. I know a diplomat, and that diplomat was from a key middle power state. I won't say which one, but they were from a key middle power state. They got invited to conferences, and they went to a conference where international academics, other diplomats had been invited, and a number of South Korean speakers there were talking about middle powers. They started to talk about middle powers and the concept of South Korea being between East and West, between developed and developing, being between the United States and China. By now, the diplomats getting pretty nervous, pretty awkward, or between the United States and North Korea. So the concept that a middle power is a state which is actually in the middle. For states which are traditional middle powers, such as Australia or Canada or even Sweden, these states have never thought of themselves as in the middle. Australia or Canada always thought of themselves as middle powers, but they were always very close to the United States, never in the middle between the United States and anyone else. So this concept has fundamentally changed as it traveled into a new language. You think about this, a concept which you think is meaning one thing, and it moves into another language and it means something totally different. This is how concepts travel. And in international relations, we have lots of concepts which are pretty messy. They're contested and competed for definitions even within the English language. When they go from one language boundary to another language boundary, there's a great potential for confusion. And if you think about in international relations, well, there are also some words, some terms, which we even don't want to actually conceptualize or define. Because if we actually do define them, we know communication is going to break down. In the context of the Korean Peninsula, the last two, denuclearization and human rights, have purposely been not defined, either in English or in Korean. They're left just out there at the moment because it's too difficult. So, if all of these concepts can mean so many different things between languages, it's important to understand how culture and language actually plays a role in our assessment of international relations. Now, it's too difficult for me to look at all these different terms related to North Korea and look at how they're interpreted between English and their semantic meaning between English and Korean. That would be a massive task. Instead, I chose to look at just one simple term, and that is simply North Korea. So, in English and Korean, what words are associated with North Korea? What concepts are associated with North Korea? What type of research does it attract? Who undertakes research on it? What arguments are made around the term? And what narratives or stories are told about the term? So to do this, I collected 2 samples of inputs from materials published between January the 1st, 2017 and March the 30th, 2019. So the period corresponds to the start of what we could call the 2017-18 North Korea nuclear crisis, the subsequent easing of tensions in 2018-19, the stasis after the second Trump-Kim summit in February 2019. So the first sample consisted of 330 inputs into policy discourse in the English language. The second sample, the same number in the Korean language. So the samples are statistically insignificant compared to the corpus or the whole body of material on North Korea. But representativeness is not what I needed. Representativeness of that would be almost pointless. What I needed was relevance. And let's face it, there's a lot of material out there on North Korea. And a lot of it is totally useless, pointless. So I needed a very relevant sample. So to get these 2 relevant samples, I undertook 5 steps. So first of all is direct selection based upon recognition of the North Korea watcher's name. Second, I undertook samples or collected samples which were referred to me by people who were interviewed or surveyed who were North Korea watchers. Then I looked at rank in academic meta-search databases. Then I looked at rank in social media appearance, and then I looked at rank in prominent media search engines or search indexes. So the result is a purposive sample in both languages, which could be considered to drive policy discourse on North Korea. And this was confirmed by a review of a number of North Korea watchers, so it does have face validity in that it does represent policy discourse. So the results I got are fairly interesting, particularly, well, I'll get to that shortly. Okay. So the first thing to know is that policy discourse on North Korea in both the English and Korean language is classified as a core national security interest problem. So this is reflected in the social status of authors, the institutions to which they're affiliated, and as well as the types of products and the publishers use to push the policy discourse. About the authors themselves. So firstly, the sample shows that more Korean language authors hold higher degrees than English language authors. Now, this is not too surprising given the importance of education in both countries, relevant importance. At the same time, more English language authors had government and military experience, or military experience. So again, this is not too surprising regarding expectations regarding the expertise in the specific field that the English language policy discourse focuses on. So essentially, Korean language policy discourse is more influenced by academia, whereas English language discourse is more influenced by government or military experience. So this demonstrates content validity with the findings on keywords, subjects, methodology, and sources. Another important point to note is there is a very large gender imbalance in North Korea watchers. So in both the English language and Korean language samples, there is gender imbalance. So males are substantially more represented in Korean language discourse, 312 out of 330. This is particularly high representation in think tank and academic discourse as well. So everyone recognizes the challenges associated with gender imbalance in Korean society, but it's not that much different in the English language sample either. So males are also much more represented in English language discourse, 277 out of 330. And there was a more even balance in academia and media. So third, policy discourse on North Korea in both Washington and Seoul is spread across a wide range of institutional affiliations. So while English language discourse is widespread, there's a smaller number of sources that are substantially more prominent. Specifically, think tanks are substantially more prominent, and they reach out through the media and through social media to a much greater extent. Korean language discourse is less widespread, with academic and think tank discourse dominating. So in particular, South Korean government-sponsored think tanks are very prominent. So, for example, the Korea Development Institute. KDI produced 50 reports in the period which I'm looking at. Those 50 reports were on a variety of subjects, but the strange thing is that those 50 reports are such a large number, but it didn't reach out in social media and it didn't reach out in the media. So even though they had a large amount of research, it didn't have a great reach. So you can see here the different item types. So you can see that both English and Korean language mainstream media and mainstream media op-eds are not significantly different in representation. The greatest difference is the influence of English and Korean language academic papers and think tank reports, which I'll look at in the following slide in more detail. So relatively speaking, Korean language academic papers hold a higher degree of influence in policy discourse. In contrast, in the English language, institutional reports hold a higher degree of influence in policy discourse. And this in part can be explained by how I categorize academic versus institutional, and yeah, I'll touch upon this in the next slide. So, in English language policy discourse, there's a larger proportion of policy-focused academic papers and institutional reports. So, policy-focused papers and reports have only limited theoretical arguments and limited supporting evidence. Instead, they focus on reasoned arguments, policy prescriptions, with the vast majority relying on tertiary sources. So when I say tertiary sources, I mean things such as media reporting and other academic or institutional reports. And this even includes a number of the academic articles in English language policy discourse. So I had to categorize them as academic articles because they're in an academic journal. But in fact, when you look at the actual article and you look through the methodology, you know, if it was in any other subject except for North Korea studies, it probably wouldn't be published. There's just not enough evidence. If it was focusing on China, if it was focusing on Japan, if it was focusing on any other country, it probably would not be accepted by the editor at the first view. There's just not enough evidence going in there. Instead, they focus on policy and policy questions, and that allows a lot less evidence to have to be produced. This is in stark contrast to the example from Korea. So Korean language discourse has a greater proportion of standardized long-form manuscripts with well-developed theoretical arguments, supporting empirical evidence and references and tables and figures. Now, that's not to say that these studies are better or not, but it just shows that it's a totally different approach. Further, unlike English language discourse, policy arguments in Korean language discourse also use secondary data to justify arguments. So a large number of Korean language institutional reports basically follow the same procedures as academic papers. They follow a more traditional standardized academic format. So if you look at the research purpose, so research purpose relates to basically what you're doing in the research. So you can have exploratory research where you're looking at a new topic with little evidence and little previous research. You can have descriptive research where you're given a very detailed and accurate picture of a process or a phenomenon. And you can have explanatory research where you're testing theory, extending theory, or finding the reasons and the causes of why something occurs. So you can see there that in English, there's a lot more descriptive research. In Korean, a lot more explanatory research. So explanatory research is basically, I guess you could say it's at the height of methodology in that you're undertaking the other processes. So with exploratory research, you're going into this much effort. If you're doing descriptive research, you're going up to the next level. You're doing explanatory, you basically got to cover the other two. So explanatory research is a much more traditional academic format. Then you can look at the methodological approaches between the two languages. So quantitative research, of course, deals with numbers. So quantitative research is often argued to be more objective. You're seeking to generalize, you're using statistics. Qualitative research is where, well, you're looking for deeper context. You're going more in depth, and arguably it's a little bit more subjective. You can see that English language uses less quantitative research, whereas Korean language research uses a lot more quantitative research. And then we come to the sources. So the sources, I think, are quite significant. So Korean language discourse uses a lot more primary and secondary research. So primary research is where you're undertaking research face-to-face, basically. You're undertaking interviews with defectors, you're undertaking interviews with government officials, or you're undertaking interviews face-to-face and right on the cutting edge of the research. Secondary research is where you're using somebody else's research, basically, like government statistics or government data on immigration or government data on anything. And then you have tertiary research. Tertiary research is where you're actually using somebody's writing, which is actually reporting on somebody else's research. So most often understood as media articles. So you can see that Korea has a lot more use of primary and secondary resources. English language sources have a lot more tertiary sources. So that says quite a lot about the way research is undertaken and the focus in the two areas, or the two languages, sorry. So, policy discourse on North Korea in English and Korean also demonstrates significantly different boundaries and conceptual framing of issues. So, the way boundaries are formed and the way concepts are framed determine whether policy approaches are viewed as viable or even possible. So, both Korean and English language discourse have the same keywords. Everyone knows which keywords they are. Nuclear, missile, denuclearization, summit, Kim Jong-un. Both languages are the same. But the secondary keywords are very different between the two languages. So, secondary keywords in the English language maintain the same national security focus. So they include words such as sanctions, conflict, strategy, trust, compliance. Secondary keywords in Korean are more diverse, more spread across different subjects. So they include words such as reconciliation, unification, Gesong, economy, China. So you can see where this is going. The subjects in the samples are also quite different. So this is perhaps the most significant finding. In Korean language policy discourse, it goes beyond the focus on nuclear issues and missiles, goes beyond foreign policy, goes beyond leadership issues, and goes beyond military affairs. There's just about the same amount of materials on economic affairs, economic cooperation, as well as social and cultural affairs. This is a totally different way of looking at North Korea. So, following the same line, narrative reasoning. I also looked at narrative reasoning and how you perceive risk when you're talking about North Korea. So, narrative reasoning is basically where you look at the stories which are being told, the stories which connect and enhance and give contextual meaning to discourse. So, in the context of risk, Korean language discourse is weighted in favor of short to medium term, not risk, but opportunity. English language discourse is heavily weighted in favor of short-term risk. Now, a very interesting way to look at this is in the context of the very few fictional pieces I included in my sample. So, fiction does add to policy discourse, and there's classic examples of this throughout history. So if you think of Eugene Burdick's and William Lederer's The Ugly American, it was, an interesting novel. It was about US diplomacy in Southeast Asia, but it was influential, and it led to the creation of the Peace Corps in the United States. So it was fiction, but it had a major influence upon policy ultimately. So there's two books here that you can see which attracted a lot of attention and a lot of discussion in social media regarding North Korea. So the first one, Our Aspiration is War, was actually published in 2016, before my reporting period, but the amount of conversation which continued through the reporting period, I had to include it. The second one, by Jeffrey Lewis, the 2020 Commission report, also attracted a lot of discussion. So these novels have one thing in common. They're both about dystopian futures. They're looking at a potential future which in some ways is quite negative. Well, for Lewis's book, it's very negative. So, Jung's novel is about a dystopian future and a distinct unification scenario. It looks at the social impact of a specific unification scenario on individual North Koreans and South Koreans. Lewis's novel is about a dystopian future scenario, but how war starts between the United States and North Korea. So, these two very different books have very similar structuring, I guess you could say, but the way they conceptualize North Korea could not be more different. From the example from the United States, the conceptualization is that North Korea is in a very narrow security frame. It's emphasizing conflict risk and conflict risk to the United States. The South Korean conceptualization is in a much broader frame. It's looking at social and economic challenges of unification. And despite the title, it's actually not about war, it's not about conflict, it's really about unification and the impact upon individuals. So I think these two very different books actually reflect the findings in my research. My current study actually demonstrates that North Korea is conceptualized very differently between the United States, or between the English and Korean languages. Culture and language are an important explanatory factor in how we see North Korea. So, of course, there are limits to this research. So, I touched upon this earlier, but the study assumes that there's a relationship between the Korean and English languages. It assumes that English is a primary language for inputs into policy discourse in Washington, and that Korean is a primary language for policy discourse in Seoul. But there's a distinct relationship there. So in language hierarchy theory, in sociolinguistics, between a dominant and subdominant language pair, such as English, which we'll call L1, and Korean, which we'll call L2, there's certain characteristics which are demonstrated. So the percentage of L1 speakers amongst the L2 population will be greater than the percentage of L2 speakers amongst the L1 population. So this implies there's a much broader flow of information going from L1 to L2. In this case, a much broader flow going from English into Korean. But at the same time, a much smaller flow going from Korean into English. So dependent upon the numbers, this means that with a limited flow of ideas, a gatekeeper role is established. So a gatekeeper role is where somebody who has special access to the language is able to control and dominate that particular area. And so the current study broadly reflects that. So another area which must be looked at as a limit is the sampling. So the sample selection is based upon those criteria I went through before. So the first two were direct selection based upon recognition of the North Korea watcher's name, and the second one was referral by interviewed North Korean watchers. So this could be expected to provide accurate results, but all individuals are influenced by criteria which are external to the quality of intelligence analysis. So this could include prestige, brand recognition, peer expectations. So when I ask a North Korea watcher, who is the best North Korea watcher, and they respond, they may not be responding upon who does the best analysis. They could be responding upon who's the most famous, who's in the media the most, and so on. So, it should work in the right pattern, but there's chances are that they're just responding to somebody's fame, particularly if that North Korea watcher is more interested in fame and the limelight. They may envy somebody who is in the limelight. So it could lead to a biased sample. Secondly, the other criteria which I use for the sample selection, including rank in academics, meta-search databases, rank in prominent search engines, and rank on social media appearances. These are all dependent upon algorithms. So algorithms reflect the requirements of the company or the creator of the algorithm rather than the quality of analysis. So algorithms can also be manipulated very easily by using certain keywords or by using and following certain trends. So academics, when you do an academic article nowadays and your academic article is actually posted up, they ask you, what keywords do you want to use? They're promoting keywords because they know keywords actually result in your article going up the ranks in search engines. Obviously, think tanks and institutions are aware of this. They have marketing support. They are able to promote their reports. So some North Korea watchers pointed out to me that there's this division between, they say that it's not really analytical quality which gets promoted in policy discourse, but it's who makes the most noise that gets promoted in policy discourse. So this is a very academic versus think tank sort of approach. Academics, they write their paper and they end up, being unknown very shortly after. Think tanks, they write the paper and it keeps on getting promoted through the marketing. Okay, so past the limits, one last limit. You can see there a tweet by Donald Trump. The tweet reads, "So funny to watch people who have failed for years. They got nothing, telling me how to negotiate with North Korea, but thanks anyway." This is basically directed at North Korea watchers. It's actually basically directed at the very high-level North Korea watchers, people who have experience in previous administrations, people who've been at the forefront of North Korea watching and have a lot to give. So the denigration of expertise is very prominent. If we think about social media, foreign interference, populism, political polarization, extremism, and then the Trump effect, we can imagine that, there's a few challenges as to whether policy discourse actually influences decision-making. So, given all of this, I've pointed out that there is a distinct difference between policy discourse in Korean language and the English language. Why doesn't it get more attention? I think it's because of crisis diplomacy. So, crisis diplomacy is a distinct process. It involves interaction between states under a heightened threat of systemic change or conflict, and there's usually just two sides to crisis diplomacy. The aggressor uses provocation or the threat of expanded conflict to force a partner to back down to secure their objectives. The respondent manages or resolves potential conflict in order to avoid descent into a wider conflict. So in the Korean Peninsula, South Korea has often taken the role of responder. North Korea has often taken the role of aggressor. Since the 1990s, crisis diplomacy has been a pattern which diplomacy falls into. North Korea undertakes a limited, sometimes non-directly attributable provocation. South Korea manages, de-escalates, and then regroups. But crisis diplomacy is a process. It involves high-level decision-making, close political control over military engagement, close coordination between partners and allies, and clear signaling. But importantly, crisis diplomacy only works for a short period. It basically runs out as soon as the threat of imminent conflict disappears. So it provides a set of tools to manage conflict or the threat of conflict, but it doesn't provide a set of tools to address long-term policy objectives. So what I've pointed out is that there are different long-term policy objectives in the policy discourse between Korea and English language areas. So as we get further away from crisis diplomacy, this is going to float up to the surface again. Pyongyang is different in Washington and Seoul. If it is different, we need to have ways to make sure that these long-term policy objectives, when they come out, are actually not going to lead to any risk of negative consequences between South Korea and the United States. So, ways to address this include increased transparency in policy objectives. So there's lots of reasons why a state wants to hide their long-term policy objectives. The simple role of greater compliance. If you have a shared goal, your partner is willing to work with you much closer. But hiding long-term policy objectives also carries a risk of surprise at a later point, carries a risk of rupture in relations, it carries a risk of decreased trust. So it's very risky to hide long-term policy objectives. In fact, I think they should be brought forward. You should use public diplomacy to really promote them. So this could include greater interaction between the policy communities of Korea and the United States. It could include greater use of foreign policy, foreign ministry spokespeople, which is something which is being done in many countries nowadays. Or it could include greater use of digital public diplomacy, something which Korea is quite far behind other states at the moment. So digital public diplomacy is really effective. Tweeting diplomats can comprise very strong identities. They can directly interact with reporters and with policymakers. But South Korea hasn't done much to progress digital diplomacy at this stage. South Korea is an incredibly powerful and effective actor in digital public outreach, but unfortunately not digital public diplomacy. So I guess this has demonstrated that Pyongyang is different in Washington and Seoul, but it is manageable. And the only risk which is going to come is in the period when crisis diplomacy stops being thought of as a crisis and we start to think more about long-term policy objectives regarding North Korea. Thank you.
Thanks for that great presentation, Jeff. And I'll just note that in your policy recommendations in the paper, you also talk a little bit more about the need for South Korea to have more of a role in Washington, a voice in Washington as well, which is in the paper, as I mentioned. But I had two quick questions before we move the conversation over to the audience. The extent to which you argue that the interests, the policy objectives between Washington and the U.S. are different, and that the conversation doesn't necessarily, it's not visible right now, because of crisis diplomacy. But I wanted to push you a little bit on that. To what extent could it be other factors as well? There's the push and pull factors between the United States and South Korea. You know, the push factors, what they have, push them away, they have different long-term objectives as you highlight, but then there's strong pull factors that stem from other things other than crisis diplomacy. The alliance, the strength of the alliance, the relationship that the U.S. has with South Korea. To what extent could other factors be at play, namely the alliance and the need for it, as opposed to the past few years where things have sort of gotten more acute as North Korea has, we've been closer to the brink of conflict, but we've stepped back and now we're managing the crisis, as you put it.
Okay, I think the alliance is probably one of the issues which is going to come up more and more as we progress through the Trump administration. I think the alliance is actually not as strong as people really think it is. And I've noticed this amongst young people in South Korea, teaching at Yonsei University. Some people really question the alliance. And I've also heard this amongst academics in South Korea, and also actually there was a recent conference at the Australian National University, and reading through the different statements which were made, I think there's pretty good reasons to really take a much deeper look at the alliance and how to strengthen the alliance, because I think it's not as strong as a lot of people assume it to be. And with the long-term policy objectives being different, the alliance is always going to give confidence in the short term, and if you feel threatened, the alliance is going to make you feel good. But in the context of long-term policy objectives, I think we've got to really take a really close look at the alliance, and it needs some attention.
Speaking of the alliance, I think Trump has come into play not only as he addresses the Korea watchers, but about South Korea and how how much or how little South Korea contributes to the state of the relationship, which is sort of tangential to the point I want to ask, but it's really not clear, because the expert community just telling Trump to do one thing on the alliance as well, to push aside the short-term interest that he's looking for on the money side, and to look for the larger, more intangible benefits of the alliance. But it's not really clear how much Trump listens to the community, these conversations that we're having. But at the same time, the perception in Seoul has been that Washington is too negative about these talks. So with a difference between Trump and the policy community both exhibited on North Korea and on the alliance, how important are these conversations, and how concerned, you're just coming from Seoul, how concerned are people in Seoul right now about the conversations that are going on in Washington that are more conservative than they would like them to be?
I think a lot of concerns regarding Korea-US relations have been glossed over or have been hidden by crisis diplomacy, so I don't think this has been thought of in much detail at the moment. But as I mentioned, I think as the threat of conflict decreases, and if it does, then these issues are going to come to the fore more and more. If you think about at the very beginning of, even during the election period in South Korea, commentators were saying that Moon and Trump are totally different. They're ideologically different. They've got different policy objectives. They're so different. But then as soon as the threat of conflict started to increase, and you had that very frantic diplomatic process, you had, let's say, South Korean officials on the White House lawn promoting the idea that Trump is going to meet with Kim. Then next you had South Korean president and North Korean leader basically dancing over the border between the two countries, watched by all of South Korea and most of the United States. And then you have Trump and Kim meeting. I mean, these are unprecedented events, and they happened in like March, April, June. It's like bang, bang, bang. When you have such a frantic diplomatic process, it's easy to overlook long-term objectives. It's very easy in periods of crisis to totally forget about your long-term objectives. And even though some commentators every now and again talk about the differences between South Korea and the United States, I think on the whole, they're kind of like, they're just hidden at the moment.
Well, in your paper, I kind of alluded to this earlier, about different suggestions that you have for South Korea to really help improve the relationship with the U.S. And since this has been a running thread for these past couple of questions, I feel like I should give you an opportunity to talk about that.
Yeah, I think there's some important areas which South Korea could promote and project its long-term policy objectives and actually get acceptance of those long-term policy objectives. So, forums such as this, forums where you bring together academic and policy communities between the US and South Korea are extremely important. But more than that, I think you need to also have a very concerted public diplomacy campaign to promote those long-term policy objectives, to justify them, to actually show that they're important not just to your own country's aims, but also potentially serve the other country's aims as well. And again, I can't emphasize more the importance of digital diplomacy. Digital public diplomacy is so important nowadays. I mean, you think about it, the president himself uses Twitter all the time. Public digital diplomacy is essential. And if you're using it as South Korea uses it at the moment, it's not effective. So if you have an ambassador here, an ambassador there, an ambassador there, and they're putting out a tweet goes and disappears, right? But if you have every diplomat in the post retweeting what that ambassador has posted, and then you have every official in the Home Foreign Ministry retweeting what has been tweeted, you have a build-up. And not only do you just put out those tweets, but you also make sure you hashtag them, you link them, and you use social media effectively. All of a sudden, you're connecting to foreign publics, you're connecting to policymakers themselves. South Korea is not doing this at the moment, and it's very strange because South Korea is incredibly effective at digital diplomacy in public outreach, but in terms of public diplomacy, reaching foreign audiences, it's just not working. So there's a conceptualization of public diplomacy in South Korea that senses that public diplomacy is borderless. There's actually no border between your own country and the foreign public. So this is quite popular in very contemporary research on public diplomacy. But a lot of that was undertaken looking at United States public diplomacy. So the idea that when the United States talks to its own citizens, it's also talking to the world. It's borderless. But that's a dominant language. If you are using public diplomacy and you're outreaching to your own citizens in Korean, you're not reaching very far. Overseas, you're only reaching other expatriate Koreans who speak Korean, or you're reaching people who have studied Korean for so long, they already love Korea. So you're almost preaching to the converted. So, if you're going to use public diplomacy in Korean language, it's not going to work. You really need to engage in English language in order to make sure that you're reaching everyone. And there's whole structures in South Korea's foreign ministry at the moment which kind of prevent this. I mean, diplomats are always risk averse. Diplomats in South Korea's foreign ministry are particularly risk averse. Nobody wants to make a mistake. Diplomats hate making mistakes, and if you're a junior in the South Korean foreign ministry, the last thing you want to do is make a mistake in social media. So it's very difficult to implement. It needs to be implemented from the top, and you need to have a really good structure and plan, but there's plenty of countries to follow their processes, and there's plenty of good academics out there willing to help out. So, it can be done. It really can be done.
Thanks for those great comments, in addition to a great presentation. Now we'll turn things over to the audience. We have a few mics running around. We'll take them in threes. We'll start with Ambassador King, and then we'll work our way this way. Hey, right here.
Thanks. I found your presentation to be particularly interesting. The one question that I have is that it's so limited in time that it focuses just on the Obama administration here and basically in South Korea on the Moon Jae-in administration. Do you have any sense of what the differences are before Trump came in? Because it seems to me that, particularly here in the United States, this represents a real discontinuity from the way things functioned well before that. And to some extent in South Korea as well. The other thing that would be interesting is what happened during the Sunshine period, the post-Sunshine period, and the current period in South Korea, and how that affected this issue of communication. Extremely interesting.
I'm a Peter Humphrey, Intel analyst and a former diplomat. I'm intrigued by the fact that Kim Jong-un's regime can kill 1,200, 1,500 people a month, and that puts a certain brake on U.S. foreign policy, even given the last 2 years. But I see no such brake in modern South Korea, where that number could jump to 3,000 a month, 6,000 a month, hell, 10,000 a month. And the South Koreans would still be living in la-la land with this insane hope that things are going to change radically. What is it about the culture or the language that is pulling the wool over South Korean eyes?
Steve Winters, independent consultant. Very interesting. I wonder if you could say something about further about the difference in the language and speaking about emotive language. For example, you mentioned the unprecedented events and meetings and huggings and dancing. Even one of our very top Korea policy people, experts, said right from the podium there that she was just, it was like overwhelmed. With emotion. Just an overwhelming emotion, right? And you could just see she really wanted to believe all this is true. Everything is wonderful, and yet in the subsequent couple of months, I observed her in several other meetings being pulled back into the sort of the Washington official viewpoint. No, we can't really trust the guy. It's the old Kim playbook, and all the whole thing about the emotion. Oh no, no, we can't get emotional about this. We've got to be clear-headed. But I'm sure in South Korea there must have been a lot of emotive words that are still being used to describe what's going on. Maybe I'll just stop at that.
I think the third question basically answers the second question. So human rights in, this comes down to language again. It's like the conceptualization of human rights between Korean language and English language, quite different. In the cultures, is very different. And that goes down to things such as history, the way you see human rights. So, one reason for overlooking human rights issues is the emotive discourse. speaking to people and seeing people during that period of that meeting, it was incredibly emotive. And there was lots of even foreigners in South Korea. You could see them with a little bit of glassy eyes, in their hope that something was going to occur, something positive was going to happen. So, I think basically emotion is a very powerful factor in overcoming the recognition that this is a terrible regime and it's doing terrible things, and it's just I guess the sense of hope reduces people's willingness to look at that. On the first question, I think it all comes down to volume. So I had 330 in Korean language, 330 items in English language, and looking through the methodology and the sources used in every different area, it's pretty tiring. But I think you're dead right, and I think so. This is going to be part of a book project, and this will be expanded version. Will hopefully be one chapter and another chapter looking at language and best practices in intelligence analysis, and the others are looking at the North Korea watchers. And in that, I might try and expand it, but it depends upon how many research associates I can get to help me and how much time I have. But yeah, I think it would be a great idea to do that, and I'd really like to do that, but it's just an incredible load of work. Yeah, thank you.
We'll do up front, and then Nick and Mark.
Thank you for sharing your research on the difference between the English and Korean language discourse in North Korea. It was interesting for me to see how the Korean discourse uses the word North Korea in a context of social and economic challenges, not limited to the military, nuclear, or military issues, and reunification, and not the war. So do you see this as a good thing or a bad thing? Is there any comments on that, please? Thank you.
Hi, Nicholas Hamasevich, PhD candidate at Catholic University. With the uncertainty on how effective the efforts are from the analysts and the academics on influencing foreign policy, and you talked about how the U.S. is more, the English language is more descriptive and using tertiary sources versus the explanatory and primary sources of the Korean. If there's uncertainty about the effectiveness, is there some way that the two languages, if they kind of came together in sort of a more similar pattern of describing and analyzing North Korea, would that help connect some of these issues that seem to be disparate and that we're missing between the two countries and two languages in the analysis of North Korea? Thank you.
Yeah, Mark Tokola from KEI. I had two questions. First, were you able to look at the government North Korea watchers also, or was it just about non-government North Korea watchers, the relationship between the two of them? And the second, in judging whether think tanks have influence or not, was that based on the think tank's perception of whether they're influencing policy, or the government's perception of whether it's taking advice and information?
So on the first question regarding whether I think it's good or bad that in Korean language discourse there's a much broader sway of ideas addressing or concerning North Korea, I'm not really considering whether it's good or bad. I just think it just shows that it's different, and it's just fundamentally different. And if you have a fundamentally different way of conceptualizing something, that means that you're going to look for policy processes and you're going to look for policy platforms which are going to be different, and you're going to start going down different tracks sooner or later. So I guess it's bad in that sense, in that if you're conceptualizing something differently, then sooner or later your policy is not going to work together. You're going to have to undertake more compromise to actually make those policies work together. On the second question, so regarding the different sources which are used, and if the languages actually came together, could you have better I guess, a more level use of sources and more level use of methodologies. Definitely, I think that's very true. But without language, without access to the Korean language, you probably couldn't access a lot of the sources which Korean authors use. But KDI and KIEP and the Korea Institute of National Unification, they've all had programs in the past where they translate Korean research into the English language. Sometimes the programs, put out a lot of English language resources. Sometimes they put out less. Sometimes they put out the most important ones and neglect the other ones which have really good data. If there was more consistency in how the Korean language resources are actually put into English, I think that would open up a lot of data to English language researchers, and I think it would actually balance out the approach between the researchers in their use of methodologies and sources and their research approaches. Mark, your question on think tanks. So the think tank reports how influential they are in foreign policy discourse. The North Korea watchers were concerned that that the think tanks have too much of an advantage through promotion and through marketing support. And I guess this is probably coming from academics who believe that academic papers could be more informative, could be much better, but they just disappear until another academic references it, and even then it doesn't get much sway. But those think tank reports keep on coming up in social media feeds. Good marketing teams will put something out there and then it will come out again, and as soon as there's another event which even reflects or looks something like the previous research, it'll go out there again and it'll keep on getting pushed out there. So they are highly influential, and it doesn't matter whether you're in government or you're in the public, if those reports keep on coming out and keep on getting pushed again and again and again, it's sooner or later it's going to influence. Whereas those academic papers, they disappear. The number of academic papers is very high as well, and it's hard to be an academic nowadays.
The government question with people in or out of government that you looked at.
Sorry, Mark, regarding the North Korea watchers, whether I was able to speak to government people as well. Only a very limited number, actually. Obviously, if you're working in government, there's restrictions on who you can talk to, whether you can even fill in a survey. If a link gets sent to you, the first thing you do is delete it. So, a lot of government North Korea watchers were not able to spend a lot of time with me, and very few of them were able to fill in the survey. And there's also, amongst North Korea watchers, there's a very distinct hierarchy. So, you get this level, the very top of North Korea watchers. You all know who they are. They're the ones who are on every panel. People like Mark himself. They're up there, right? They're up the top. And, they don't respond to surveys when some schmuck from Yonsei University is sending a survey, they just don't. So, that's difficult as well. So I think that's one section of the North Korea watcher community which I just really couldn't access. Hopefully, as the research progresses, maybe, I'll start to get more feedback from them. But, so I think the sample is a little bit biased in that I wasn't able to survey and speak to a lot of people who are currently in government and a lot of the top-notch North Korea watchers. Although I must say that some of them did spend time with me, and some of them were more than willing to help out. Some of them are really, really, insightful and friendly.
Mark, I'm sure you're one of the exceptions to the rule as well. We have a question here and a question right behind him. Yes.
Thank you. Yano Kim, non-resident fellow at KEI. I think my question has been touched upon, but I want to be a little bit more specific. So I found that the research papers written in Korean are more focused on the dynamic internal changes in North Korea, including marketization, than the research papers available in English. And what do you think that fact impacts the policy dialogue between Washington and Seoul? Any chances of misunderstanding or lack of coordination? If you had find any kind of concerns, I'd like to ask you to share with us. And one more question: the role of media. I think the media in Korea and the United States, when it comes to North Korea, they have different interests. South Korean media more interested about the linkage between North Korea and their domestic politics, whereas the U.S. Threat reduction or threat management would be the top priority for them. So, what kind of media role did you find in your research?
Hi, I'm Soyeon Kim from Radio Free Asia. Actually, I have a question. It's not really directly related to your research. Hopefully, to find. I just want to ask you about the current event. Recently there was a summit between Kim Jong-un and Russian president, and I want to ask you about the different view on this between the U.S. and South Korea, and more specifically about the Putin suggests six-party talk. And do you think, would the United States and South Korea be happy to have this six-party talk? Thank you.
All right, Young-ho. I think when you're looking at those, when you're conceptualizing North Korea differently, if we're getting policy discourse which is bringing out economics after economics, and the number of studies in Korean language which are focused on economics with North Korea it basically balances. I'd say even like the same number are on economics versus security issues. In fact, maybe there's more on economics when you include social and cultural affairs. If your policy discourse is promoting economics, if your policy discourse is promoting nukes and military affairs, you're going to have ultimately different policy objectives. So I think it has a great impact ultimately upon policy because you're conceptualizing a different problem. On one hand, you're conceptualizing the idea of how you're going to resolve a long-term problem by ensuring that there is stability in your neighbor and ensuring that you're going to have a long-term resolution by ensuring that you can integrate economically and hopefully get gradual change in a country. But if you're focusing on the risk or the short-term risk of missiles and nukes, you're going to have a totally different policy approach, right? You're going to be tempted towards having a much stronger policy approach if you really sense threat. So I think it has a massive impact. On the second question, the second part of your question regarding, was it the second question? No, the second actual question, I think, on media. So I think media, I don't think media actually has policy priorities. I think media is actually there just to sell. Media is actually there to attract readers or to attract viewers. I think media, it doesn't matter what is going on between the government and the linkages or the government policy. They're just there to serve a particular corporate purpose, and that is to increase the number of viewers, to increase the number of readers. And so for that reason, it's has a tendency towards anything that is sensationalist. You're much better off having a report on nuclear missiles than economic interaction, because nuclear missiles, wow, economic interaction. So that's the nature of the media, I guess. So on the last question regarding my opinions on North Korea, So I'm not actually a North Korea watcher. I'm a North Korea watcher. So, I try to avoid making commentary on North Korea. My focus is South Korea and South Korean foreign policy. That's where my interest is. I think if you become a North Korea watcher, you're pretty much going around in a circle again and again and again and saying the same things over and over. So I'm trying not to do that.
Question right here, and then we'll take another question here.
Hi, I'm Jenny Park with the U.S. Journal. Just quick questions. Do you think President Trump well known about Kim Jong-un and well known about the inside of North Korea? Because of a president position is very important when nuclear negotiation tables, but without these watchers giving him some kind of consultations, I think we have really, really dangerous, this kind of negotiations. So would you willing to give sometimes maybe advice to White House or President? Thank you.
Hi, thanks very much for your interesting work, and I agree with your recommendation that South Korea should try harder in terms of public diplomacy. My question has to do with who else bears the burden of understanding the Korean viewpoint and appreciating its concern about the long run. Isn't it the job of an American diplomat to proactively seek out the South Korean view? And this gets to the question of who matters most in that I would imagine high-ranking American foreign policy personnel would be talking to high-level South Korean diplomats, and to what extent is South Korean diplomacy influenced by the South Korean academic work?
So on the first question, regarding Trump and his negotiations with the leader of North Korea, so in diplomatic studies at the moment, there's this argument that face-to-face diplomacy is really important. When you're actually face-to-face with somebody, you can see how they react, you can get that psychological vibe, and you can really understand their intentions and so on. But this is face-to-face diplomacy. And my argument is that Donald Trump is not a diplomat. He's a leader, sort of. This is very different, and this is very, very fundamentally different. A diplomat is trained to understand cultural differences. A diplomat is trained to be fully aware of the meanings and the nuances in other cultures. They're representing their leader, but they're not the leader themselves. And so for having the leader themselves go out and do the negotiation, it's almost silly. It's like playing chess and putting your king out the very front and leaving your pawns behind. Now, not to say that diplomats are pawns, maybe diplomats are rooks and bishops, but all the same, you don't put your king out there first or your queen out there first. You want to make sure that you have your juniors negotiating these things, and perhaps you have special envoys negotiating these things. And then, only when something is ready to be signed and delivered, then you bring out the king in your chess piece. Then you bring out the leader, and then they can do a final negotiation of a very small, final political issue. But I think top-down diplomacy, it's certainly important in crisis diplomacy, but no, I don't think it should be used as a ongoing diplomatic process. There's no point to it. It's only going to end up in greater cynicism, in my opinion. I think that's actually one of the problems with South Korea's handling of the situation as well. I think they're trying to keep on going with summit diplomacy, but summit diplomacy is only going to breed more cynicism over time, in my opinion. I think you need another way to address the issue, another way of looking at it. And there are things that could be done. Middle power diplomacy is a good example, building coalitions, using activist diplomacy, using NGOs, using different ways to interact and different ways to look at the problem is very important. The next question was...
Why isn't the U.S. seeking ROK views?
So whether the United States should play a larger role in trying to understand South Korea's views. Yeah, certainly that's true. But I think if you are the home country and you are the one which has your long-term policy objectives and you know that they are your long-term policy objectives, you don't want to wait for somebody else to find them out. You want to actually promote them yourselves. I think you've got to pursue an active policy to get your long-term objectives out there. And on the second part of that question, whether South Korean diplomats, foreign ministry personnel listen to academia, I think they really do. So there's a good interaction between academics and the Ministry of Foreign Affairs in South Korea. There's a lot of interaction between them. They even have quite a few academics who go into the foreign ministry and work there for a period of time. Some very skillful academics go in there and work for a period of time, and they bring in fresh ideas and new ideas. So I think academic policy discourse in South Korea is actually listened to, and maybe it's a bit different from the US at the moment.
Well, thank you, Jeff. Unfortunately, we're out of time, but I know there's more work coming along in the pipeline, and I'm sure I speak for everyone in the room when I say we're looking forward to see what you have in store with the books and further research. But please join me in thanking Jeff for his time and answers to our questions today. Thank you.